The quickest way to discover what someone truly values is not to ask them a question, but to quietly change one piece of their world and watch what they do next. I never imagined I would test my own marriage that way. Yet one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, I convinced myself it was the only way to silence the doubts that had been growing inside me for months. My name is Daniel Brooks. I am 42 years old, and until that week, I believed I understood everything about my wife, Rachel. We had been married for 12 years, lived in a comfortable neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio, and built what most people would have called a stable life. I worked as a senior construction engineer for a regional development company, while Rachel managed marketing for a local healthcare organization. We were not wealthy, but we paid our bills on time, saved for retirement, and even talked about buying a small lake cabin after we both turned 50. From the outside, our marriage looked almost effortless. But over the previous several months, little things had begun changing. Rachel started taking more phone calls in another room. She occasionally smiled while reading messages before locking her phone without saying anything. Some evenings, she stayed late at work more often than before, always offering reasonable explanations that I accepted without argument. None of those moments proved anything. In fact, each one seemed perfectly normal by itself. Still, when enough small changes collect together, they can quietly become questions that refuse to disappear. I hated the fact that I was beginning to notice every detail. I hated myself even more for wondering whether I was imagining problems that did not exist. I never found evidence that Rachel had done anything wrong. She remained thoughtful, remembered birthdays, asked about my day, and never treated me with disrespect. Yet something inside me kept whispering that there was a part of her life I no longer understood. Instead of talking honestly about those feelings, I made the worst decision a husband could make. I decided to create a test. Earlier that afternoon, I left work an hour early after telling my supervisor I had a personal appointment. Nothing unusual had happened at the office. My job was secure, my latest project was ahead of schedule, and Mark Sullivan, my manager, had complimented my team during the morning meeting. But as I drove home, I rehearsed the same sentence again and again. I wanted to see what Rachel would do if she believed everything had suddenly changed. When she arrived home that evening, she found me sitting quietly at the kitchen table with 2 untouched cups of coffee growing cold between us. She smiled at first, then immediately noticed something was wrong. "Daniel, what happened?" she asked. I lowered my eyes and forced myself to sound defeated. "I lost my job today." The words felt heavier than I expected, even though they were completely untrue. Rachel stood perfectly still for several seconds. I watched every expression on her face, expecting panic, frustration, or disappointment. Instead, she slowly walked toward me, placed one hand gently on my shoulder, and asked only one question. "Are you all right?" I nodded without looking directly at her. "I do not know what we are going to do." She squeezed my shoulder reassuringly. "We will figure it out together. We always do." Her calm response should have ended my foolish experiment immediately. Instead, my guilty conscience convinced me she was hiding what she truly felt. We ate dinner quietly that evening. Rachel remained kind, asked if I wanted dessert, and suggested we review our budget together over the weekend. Nothing about her behavior seemed selfish or cold. Around 9 o'clock, she excused herself, saying she needed to make a quick phone call before bed. She stepped onto the back patio, leaving the sliding glass door almost completely closed but not fully latched. I stayed inside the kitchen cleaning dishes, telling myself I would respect her privacy. Then a gentle breeze shifted the door open just enough for her voice to drift back into the house. I was not trying to listen, but the first sentence I heard stopped me where I stood. "He finally told me today," Rachel whispered. After a brief pause, she added, "We have to move faster now, before he finds out everything." The sentence I heard through that half-open patio door stayed in my mind long after Rachel came back inside. "We have to move faster now, before he finds out everything." 6 simple words, yet they created a storm of questions I could not quiet. I stood alone in the kitchen pretending to finish washing dishes while my thoughts moved in every direction at once. Who was she talking to? What was I supposed to find out? Why had she sounded concerned instead of surprised about my so-called job loss? The hardest part was that nothing about Rachel's behavior matched the story my imagination was creating. She had spent the evening comforting me. She had immediately told me we would handle the situation together. If she was hiding something, why did she still act like the same person I had loved for 12 years? That contradiction bothered me more than the conversation itself. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm and barely slept through the night. Rachel was already making coffee when I entered the kitchen. She smiled and handed me a mug exactly like she did every morning. "How are you feeling today?" she asked. I watched her carefully, searching for signs that she knew something had changed. But she looked completely normal. "I am worried," I answered. "I keep thinking about what happens next." She sat across from me and reached for my hand. "Daniel, a job is not what defines you. You built a career because you are talented and hardworking. We will make adjustments if we need to." Her words should have comforted me. Instead, they made me feel even more confused. A part of me felt guilty because I was testing someone who had just shown me support. Another part of me wanted answers about the mysterious phone call. After Rachel left for work, I sat in my office and stared at my computer screen without accomplishing anything. I knew I had created this situation, but I also knew I could not ignore what I heard. The problem was that I did not want to become the kind of person who secretly investigated his wife. I had always believed trust was the foundation of marriage. Yet here I was, questioning everything. That afternoon, I decided to look for facts rather than assumptions. I started with the simplest things. I reviewed our monthly expenses, not because I suspected Rachel of anything, but because I wanted to understand whether there was a financial issue I had missed. Everything appeared normal at first. Our mortgage payments were current. Our savings account remained stable. Our credit card activity looked ordinary. Then I noticed a few transactions I did not recognize. They were not large purchases. They were small payments to a local storage company and a moving supply store. I stared at the screen for several minutes. There were reasonable explanations for both. Rachel could have been helping a coworker. She could have been organizing something for a friend. I knew that. But after hearing her conversation the night before, even harmless details started feeling suspicious. That evening, Rachel arrived home carrying a small folder. When she saw me looking at the bills, she immediately asked, "Are you checking our budget?" I quickly closed the laptop. "I was just trying to understand where we stand now that I am not working." She nodded. "That makes sense." Then she smiled softly. "Actually, I have something I want to talk to you about this weekend." My heart immediately reacted to those words. Something I want to talk to you about. After 12 years of marriage, I knew the difference between a casual comment and something important. I wanted to ask her right there. I wanted to demand an explanation for the phone call. But I stopped myself. The entire reason I created this test was to learn how she would respond under pressure. If I confronted her immediately, I would never know the truth. Later that night, after Rachel went to sleep, I sat in the living room with the lights off. I replayed every moment from the previous 24 hours. Her kindness, her calm reaction, her secret phone call, the unfamiliar transactions, the weekend conversation she wanted to have. The more I tried to connect the pieces, the less certain I became. I had expected my little test to reveal whether my wife would stand beside me during a difficult moment. Instead, it had created a question I never expected to ask. Was I discovering something hidden about Rachel, or was I discovering something uncomfortable about myself? By Friday afternoon, I realized I was no longer looking for answers. I was looking for evidence that would either calm my mind or confirm my fears. The problem was that every new detail seemed capable of supporting two completely different stories. Rachel had never lied to me as far as I knew. She had never given me a reason to doubt her loyalty. Yet I could not erase the memory of that late-night phone call or the strange sentence that had started this entire chain of suspicion. I kept telling myself that facts mattered more than assumptions, so I focused on observing rather than accusing. When Rachel came home from work that evening, she looked unusually energetic. She carried 2 grocery bags into the kitchen and immediately began talking about dinner as if nothing had happened during the past few days. She laughed when I accidentally dropped the spoon, teased me about finally having enough free time to organize the garage, and even suggested we spend Sunday driving through the countryside like we used to when we were younger. Her warmth made me question my own judgment. Was I creating a problem where none existed? Then, while putting groceries away, her phone vibrated on the counter. She glanced at the screen, smiled briefly, and quickly turned the display face down before picking it up. "I just need to answer this," she said. "It will only take a minute." She stepped into the laundry room and quietly closed the door behind her. I stayed exactly where I was. I refused to move closer. I refused to listen through the wall. I had already crossed one line by overhearing part of her conversation earlier in the week, and I was not willing to cross another. Even so, when she returned several minutes later, I noticed something I had never paid attention to before. She seemed relieved, almost as though an important problem had been solved. During dinner, she asked whether I had heard anything from my company about severance pay or future opportunities. I reminded myself that the entire story about losing my job had been invented by me. Every answer I gave was built on another lie. The realization made me increasingly uncomfortable. After dinner, Rachel said she needed to stop by a storage facility the next morning for a short errand before running a few other weekend tasks. My mind immediately returned to the unfamiliar payments I had found on our bank statement. I simply nodded and said I planned to spend the morning cleaning the garage. In reality, I had already decided that if I wanted the truth, I needed to stop guessing. Saturday morning, Rachel left the house around 9 o'clock, carrying a small envelope and a reusable shopping bag. I waited several minutes before getting into my truck and following at a careful distance. She drove across town, past several shopping centers, and eventually turned into a self-storage facility on the north side of Columbus. My heart began beating faster. I parked where she could not easily notice my vehicle and watched from a distance. Rachel entered one of the storage buildings using an access code. About 20 minutes later, she emerged, pushing a small rolling cart loaded with sealed cardboard boxes. She carefully placed the boxes into the back of her sport utility vehicle before speaking with an older woman in the parking lot. They smiled, hugged briefly, and looked through a folder together. From where I sat, I could not hear a single word. There was nothing inappropriate about what I saw, yet nothing explained why she had hidden any of it from me. Rachel then drove to a nearby print shop before stopping at a small family-owned bakery. Each location only added more questions. None matched the story I had imagined. None eliminated my doubts either. As I prepared to leave without being noticed, my phone suddenly vibrated. The caller identification displayed the name of my manager, Mark Sullivan. I answered immediately. "Daniel," he said cheerfully, "I have been trying to reach you all morning. The executive team approved the promotion we discussed. We want to announce it on Monday, but your wife called earlier this week asking if we could keep everything confidential for just a few more days because she was planning something special for you." At that exact moment, I looked through my windshield and saw Rachel carefully lifting one of the decorated boxes from her vehicle. And for the first time since my foolish test began, I realized I might have completely misunderstood the person I trusted most. The phone call with Mark Sullivan ended, but I remained parked across the street from the storage facility, unable to start my truck. Every assumption I had made during the past several days suddenly felt fragile. Rachel had spoken with my manager. She knew about the promotion I was supposed to receive. She had asked him to keep it confidential because she was planning something special. That explained at least part of her secretive behavior, but it did not explain everything. I still remembered the sentence I had overheard on the patio. "We have to move faster now, before he finds out everything." I stared through the windshield as Rachel carefully loaded the decorated boxes into her sport utility vehicle. Nothing about her actions suggested deception. She moved slowly, checking each box to make sure nothing shifted during the drive. The older woman who had helped her smiled warmly before waving goodbye. Rachel waved back, then drove away toward the bakery I had already seen her visit. I followed at a respectful distance without letting her notice me. At the bakery, she picked up several large white boxes tied with blue ribbon before stopping at a small party supply store. She spent only a few minutes inside and returned carrying paper bags filled with decorations. My mind slowly began replacing suspicion with confusion. None of this looked like someone preparing to leave a marriage or hide a betrayal. It looked like someone organizing an important celebration. Even so, I could not understand why she had hidden everything from me. I returned home before she did and spent the afternoon pretending to organize the garage exactly as I had told her I would. When Rachel arrived, she smiled naturally and carried only 2 grocery bags into the house. The decorations and boxes were nowhere to be seen. She must have returned them to the storage unit or left them somewhere else. During dinner, she continued acting exactly as she always had. She asked whether I had managed to sort through the old tools in the garage and reminded me that my mother planned to visit the following weekend. Her kindness no longer felt suspicious. Instead, it made me increasingly ashamed of the lie I had started. Every conversation we shared was built on my false claim about losing my job. Later that evening, while Rachel was reading in the living room, I stepped outside onto the back porch where everything had begun. The cool Ohio air gave me time to think. I realized that I had spent several days watching my wife while completely ignoring my own behavior. I had lied to the person I loved most, secretly followed her across town, and quietly searched through our financial records. Rachel, meanwhile, had offered support, reassurance, and patience from the very beginning. The only reason I doubted her was because I heard part of a conversation without knowing the context. I returned inside determined to tell her the truth about my so-called job loss, but before I could speak, her phone rang again. She glanced at the screen and smiled apologetically. "I need to take this for just a minute," she said. This time she did not step outside. She simply walked into the hallway, believing I was too far away to hear. I had no intention of listening, but her final sentence reached me anyway. "Yes," she said softly. "Everything will be ready by Monday evening." He still has no idea. She ended the call and walked back into the living room with the same gentle smile she had worn all week. I looked at her and realized I stood at a crossroads. I could confess my lie immediately and risk ruining whatever she had carefully planned, or I could remain silent a little longer and finally learn the full truth behind every secret, every hidden errand, and every mysterious conversation that had turned one simple test into the greatest lesson of my marriage. The following morning, I woke up earlier than usual and spent several minutes staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet sounds of the house. For years, I had believed that trust was something you either had or you did not have. Now I understood that trust was something you protected every day through honesty and communication. I had created a situation that tested my wife, but the person being tested was starting to look more like me. I had convinced myself that I needed answers, yet I had avoided the one conversation that could have given me the truth from the beginning. When Rachel walked into the bedroom with 2 cups of coffee, she smiled and handed me mine. "You look like you did not sleep well," she said. I almost told her everything right then. I almost admitted that losing my job was a lie, that I had heard part of her phone conversations, and that I had followed her across town. But before I could speak, she looked at me with genuine concern. "Are you worried about tomorrow?" she asked. I realized she was referring to the announcement at work, not knowing that I already knew about the promotion. Her kindness made it even harder to continue pretending. "A little," I replied. The guilt stayed with me throughout the day. I wanted to uncover Rachel's secret, but I also knew I had created my own secret first. That afternoon, I decided I needed to understand the full picture before making any decisions. I returned to the storage facility alone, not to follow Rachel, but to see if I could understand what she had been preparing. I had the access information from the payment records I found earlier, but I hesitated before entering. I knew I was close to crossing another boundary. Instead of opening the storage unit myself, I called Rachel. She answered after 2 rings. "Hey, Daniel. Is everything okay?" Her voice immediately reminded me why I loved her. She never sounded annoyed when I needed her. She always sounded like someone ready to listen. I almost confessed right there. But then I noticed a small sign on the storage building announcing a weekend community event. Suddenly, I wondered if the secret was not about me alone. "I am fine," I said. "I just wanted to ask if there was anything you needed from me." There was a brief pause. "Actually," she said, "I was hoping you would trust me for a few more days." Those words stayed with me, not because they sounded suspicious, but because they sounded like someone asking for patience. That evening, I returned home before Rachel and sat in the living room surrounded by memories from our 12 years together. Photos from vacations, pictures from family gatherings, the small moments that never appeared important at the time but became precious when looking back. I realized something uncomfortable. I had spent the entire week searching for proof that Rachel might disappoint me, while ignoring all the years of proof that she had always stood beside me. Later that night, my mother Linda called. She had always been able to tell when something was bothering me. "Daniel, are you and Rachel doing all right?" she asked. I hesitated. "Why do you ask?" She laughed softly. "Because your wife called me last week and asked for my help with something special." She sounded so excited. My heart skipped a beat. "What kind of help?" My mother became quiet for a moment. "I thought you knew." She wanted to make sure everything was perfect before she surprised you. After we ended the call, I sat in silence. Another piece of the puzzle had appeared, but I still did not know the whole picture. Rachel was not hiding something from me because she wanted to hurt me. She was hiding something because she wanted to give me something. The question was no longer whether my wife was loyal. The question was how much damage I had already caused by trying to test someone who had never given me a reason to fail her. The next evening, I would finally discover what Rachel had been planning. But before that happened, I had one decision to make. Would I continue pretending until I knew everything? Or would I finally be honest with the woman who had been honest with me all along? Monday evening arrived with a strange mixture of anticipation and guilt. I drove home from the office after accepting congratulations for the promotion I had pretended not to know about. Yet every mile reminded me that my greatest accomplishment that day felt insignificant compared to the conversation I still needed to have with Rachel. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something unusual. The front porch lights were already glowing, and several cars belonging to close friends and family members were parked along the street. Before I could fully understand what was happening, the front door opened. Rachel stepped outside wearing a navy blue dress I had always loved, smiling with the same warmth that first made me fall in love with her 12 years earlier. "Close your eyes for just a second," she said with a laugh. I obeyed without asking questions. She gently took my hand and led me through the front door. A moment later, I heard familiar voices counting together. 3, 2, 1. When I opened my eyes, our living room had been transformed into a celebration. Blue and silver decorations filled the walls. A large banner congratulated me on my promotion. Family photographs from every stage of our marriage surrounded the room, and one long table displayed homemade desserts, old vacation albums, and framed notes written by people who had worked with me over the years. My mother smiled from across the room, while several close friends applauded. Mark Sullivan walked over and shook my hand. "Congratulations, Daniel. You earned every bit of this." I looked around the room speechless. Every mysterious phone call, every visit to the storage facility, every decorated box, and every secret conversation suddenly made perfect sense. Rachel had spent weeks organizing the celebration while asking everyone to keep it hidden from me. The storage unit had simply been a temporary place to keep decorations and supplies. The bakery had prepared my favorite desserts. The print shop had produced the photographs and banners covering the walls. Even the older woman I had seen at the storage facility introduced herself as the owner of a local event planning business who had volunteered to help Rachel coordinate everything. I felt both overwhelmed and deeply ashamed. Throughout the evening, everyone laughed, shared memories, and celebrated together. Rachel stayed close beside me, making sure every guest felt welcome while quietly watching my reaction to each surprise she had arranged. After most of our guests had left, and the house finally became quiet again, she and I sat together at the kitchen table exactly where my foolish test had begun less than a week earlier. She reached across the table and smiled softly. "Did we surprise you?" I nodded. "More than you can imagine." She laughed gently. "I was terrified you would discover everything before tonight. Every secret phone call made me nervous." I lowered my eyes for a moment before taking a slow breath. "Rachel, there is something I need to tell you." My voice immediately became heavier. She looked at me with concern. "What is it?" I folded my hands together and decided there could be no more secrets between us. "I never lost my job." She stared at me silently, trying to understand what I meant. "I made it up," I admitted. "I told you I had been fired because I wanted to see how you would react. I convinced myself I needed to know whether you would still stand beside me if everything changed." The smile slowly disappeared from her face, not because she was angry, but because she was hurt. "You tested me?" she asked quietly. I nodded. "And then I overheard part of your phone call. I misunderstood everything. I became suspicious. I even followed you to the storage facility." The words became more difficult with every sentence. Rachel remained silent for several seconds before speaking. "Daniel, if you had simply asked me why I seemed distracted these past few weeks, I would have told you I could not answer yet because I wanted to protect a surprise. Instead, you carried all of that worry by yourself." I looked at her with genuine regret. "I know. I thought I was testing our marriage, but I was really exposing my own fears." Rachel reached for my hand after a long pause. "Then let us promise each other something. The next time fear enters our home, we talk before we imagine." Rachel's words stayed with me long after we left the kitchen that night. The next time fear enters our home, we talk before we imagine. They sounded simple, yet they revealed something I had forgotten during the previous week. Trust does not disappear all at once. It slowly weakens when silence replaces honest conversation. I had allowed my own doubts to grow because I was afraid of asking vulnerable questions. Rachel had spent days planning one of the most thoughtful surprises anyone had ever created for me, while I quietly convinced myself there was a hidden betrayal waiting to be discovered. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The following morning, I woke up before sunrise and found Rachel sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sky slowly brighten over our neighborhood. I joined her without saying anything. For several minutes, we simply enjoyed the peaceful silence. Eventually, I looked at her and said, "Thank you for giving me another chance after what I did." She smiled gently. Marriage is full of moments when both people have to decide whether they want to win an argument or protect the relationship. I chose the relationship. Her answer humbled me. During the next few weeks, I worked hard to earn back the confidence I had damaged. Not because Rachel demanded it, but because I wanted my actions to match the promises I had made. I became more intentional about sharing what I was feeling instead of pretending everything was fine. When work became stressful after accepting my promotion, I told Rachel instead of carrying the pressure alone. When she had difficult days at the office, I listened without trying to solve every problem. Slowly, our conversations became deeper than they had been in years. One Saturday afternoon, we drove to the small lake where we had celebrated our first wedding anniversary. We walked along the shoreline, remembering how uncertain we had been when we first started building a life together. Back then, we had very little money and no guarantee that our careers would succeed. Yet we trusted each other completely because we believed we were facing every challenge as a team. Somewhere along the way, we had become so busy managing schedules, bills, and responsibilities that we forgot to protect that same openness. Rachel stopped walking and looked across the water. "Do you know what hurt me the most?" she asked quietly. I nodded slowly. "The fact that I tested you?" She shook her head. "No, it was realizing you were carrying fears that you believed you had to face alone." Her words struck me harder than any criticism could have. She was right. My mistake had not started with the lie about losing my job. It had started months earlier when I noticed small changes and chose private suspicion instead of honest conversation. I reached for her hand. "I promise I will never let that happen again." She squeezed my hand gently. Then something good came from all of this. A few days later, I invited Mark Sullivan to lunch to thank him for protecting Rachel's surprise. He laughed when I admitted the entire story. "Daniel," he said, "I have managed people for 30 years. The strongest teams are never the ones without problems. They are the ones willing to talk before small misunderstandings become big ones." His advice sounded remarkably similar to what Rachel had already taught me. Looking back, I realized that nearly every person who cared about us had been helping build something positive while I was busy searching for something negative. My mother had protected Rachel's secret. My coworkers had kept the promotion confidential. Friends had spent weekends preparing decorations. Everyone had been working together to celebrate my future while I quietly questioned the one person who deserved my trust the most. That realization became the most important lesson of my entire marriage. Sometimes the greatest danger is not another person's secret. Sometimes it is the story fear quietly writes inside your own mind before you give the people you love the chance to tell you the truth. Several months passed, and life gradually settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and surprisingly new. My promotion brought additional responsibilities at work, but instead of carrying every burden alone, I learned to share both my victories and my worries with Rachel. She did the same with me. We made a quiet promise that no matter how busy life became, we would never allow assumptions to replace conversations again. Every Friday evening, we set our phones aside, prepared dinner together, and spent an hour talking about everything that had happened during the week. Sometimes the conversations were serious. Sometimes we laughed about small mistakes at work or funny moments with our neighbors. The important part was not the subject. The important part was that we listened before drawing conclusions. One afternoon, while organizing old files in my home office, I found the notebook where I had written down every suspicious detail during the week of my foolish test. I flipped through the pages slowly. There were notes about unfamiliar payments, secret phone calls, visits to the storage facility, and changes in Rachel's schedule. Looking at those pages now, I realized something remarkable. Every single observation had been accurate. The problem was never the facts. The problem was the story I attached to those facts before asking a single honest question. Rachel walked into the room carrying fresh coffee and noticed the notebook in my hands. She smiled knowingly. You found your investigation, she joked gently. I laughed for the first time about something that had once filled me with anxiety. I cannot believe I convinced myself all of this meant something terrible. She sat beside me and looked through the pages with quiet curiosity. You were trying to protect our future, she said. You just forgot that I was trying to protect it too. Her words stayed with me for the rest of the day. It would have been easy for Rachel to remind me of my mistake every time we disagreed about something. Instead, she chose compassion over resentment. That choice inspired me to become a better husband than I had been before. A few weeks later, my mother invited us to her house for Sunday dinner. As we helped clear the table afterward, she smiled at both of us. You two seem lighter these days, she observed. Rachel looked at me before answering. We finally learned that guessing is much harder than talking. My mother laughed softly. That lesson takes some people a lifetime. Driving home that evening, I realized how true those words were. Many relationships do not end because people stop caring about each other. They begin to struggle because fear quietly replaces honesty. One misunderstood moment becomes two. Two become 10. Before long, people are responding to imaginary stories instead of real conversations. I had almost allowed that to happen to us. Fortunately, Rachel's patience gave us the opportunity to change direction before lasting damage was done. Not long after, we finally purchased the small lake cabin we had dreamed about for years. It was not large or luxurious, but every time we spent a weekend there, I was reminded of how close I had come to allowing unnecessary suspicion to overshadow everything we had built together. One evening, we sat on the wooden dock watching the sunset reflect across the calm water. Rachel rested her head on my shoulder and smiled. Do you know what I remember most about that week? She asked. I expected her to mention the lie about losing my job or the surprise party. Instead, she surprised me again. I remember that after everything was over, you chose honesty instead of pride. I looked across the lake for a moment before answering. I almost chose the opposite. She gently squeezed my hand. But you did not. In that quiet moment, I finally understood something I wished I had known years earlier. Trust is not proven by secret tests. It is strengthened every time two people choose honesty when fear would be easier, and every ordinary conversation becomes another brick in the foundation of a marriage built to last. Years have passed since the week that changed the way I understood love, trust, and marriage, yet I still think about it whenever someone asks me what the strongest relationship advice I have ever received might be. They usually expect me to talk about communication, commitment, or forgiveness. Those things certainly matter, but I always begin somewhere else. I tell them that fear becomes dangerous only when it is allowed to speak louder than truth. The moment I chose to test Rachel instead of trusting her enough to have an honest conversation, I unknowingly gave fear permission to write a story that never existed. Fortunately, that story never became our reality. Life continued moving forward in the best possible way. My promotion opened new opportunities. Rachel continued growing in her own career, and together we built the peaceful future we had dreamed about for years. Every summer we spent time at our little lake cabin, where mornings began with coffee on the dock and evenings ended watching the sunset disappear behind the trees. Those quiet weekends reminded us that happiness rarely comes from dramatic moments. It grows from ordinary days shared with someone who chooses you again and again. Looking back now, I realize Rachel gave me two extraordinary gifts during that difficult week. The first was the celebration she secretly planned to honor a milestone in my career. The second was something far greater. She chose grace when she had every reason to choose disappointment. She never ignored my mistake, but she refused to let it define the rest of our marriage. That decision changed me more than any surprise party ever could. I also discovered that trust is not built because nothing suspicious ever happens. It is built because two people are willing to ask questions before making conclusions. I still remember every small detail that once seemed so alarming. The phone calls, the storage unit, the unfamiliar expenses, the hidden decorations. Every fact had been real. Only my interpretation had been completely wrong. That lesson stayed with me long after everything else faded into memory. One afternoon, nearly a year later, a younger engineer at my company asked if I had ever struggled to balance work and family. I smiled because I recognized the worry in his voice. Instead of giving him advice about careers or finances, I shared my own experience. I told him that the strongest marriages are not protected by secret tests or perfect circumstances. They are protected by difficult conversations held with honesty and respect. Weeks later, he thanked me and admitted that talking openly with his wife had solved a misunderstanding that had been growing for months. Hearing that reminded me that painful experiences can become valuable if we are willing to learn from them. Rachel and I still laugh occasionally about the week I believed I had uncovered a terrible secret. She teases me about my detective notebook, and I jokingly remind her that she almost became too good at keeping surprises. Those memories no longer bring embarrassment. They remind us how easily people can lose their way when assumptions replace conversations, and how beautiful it is when two people choose to find their way back together. If I could return to that Tuesday afternoon when I sat at the kitchen table pretending I had lost my job, I would make a different choice. I would tell Rachel about my worries instead of creating a test. I would trust the woman who had spent 12 years proving she deserved exactly that. Of course, none of us can rewrite yesterday. We can only decide what we carry into tomorrow. I carry gratitude. I carry humility. Most of all, I carry the quiet certainty that the greatest proof of love is not found in secret experiments or hidden plans. It is found in two people who continue choosing honesty over fear, understanding over suspicion, and each other over every misunderstanding that life places in their path.